Well, we know now that we have the right people in this room to answer all our questions. We will continue in this morning's session hearing about literary teaching and narrative work that goes on in medical schools and what we think it does. Our next speaker is Anne Hunsaker Hawkins. Anne is professor in the Department of Humanities at the Pennsylvania State University College of Medicine at the Milton Hershey Medical Center. Anne has been working in this field for a very long time. Her dissertation and her early graduate work was on spiritual autobiography. She wrote on Augustine. Somewhere along the way, and she'll tell us where this happened, she turned toward illness narratives as a subset or a parent set of conversion narratives. Anne did the heroic task of reading maybe hundreds of pathographies and bringing to us the germinal work. I always call it reconfiguring. It's reconstructing illness, studies in pathography, which was really the first, the opening of what is now a marvelously seminal debate about what happens when those who are ill attempt to write of their illness. She's been teaching at Penn State at all levels, medical students, faculty, staff, deans. She has been running Readers Theater, which performs at the hospital as well as in nursing homes in the area. She's the editor and the spirit behind, I believe it's called Wild Onion, a journal for creative writing of medical students, faculty, and staff. And Anne will talk with us about what happens when you do such teaching and what happens when you read such narratives.
Thanks, Rita. You can hear me okay, and I'm not blaring or anything in the back? Rita's asked me to talk about two things. First, my work on autobiographical narratives of illness, which I call pathographies. And second, what it is that we actually do when we teach literature in a medical school. What she wants is not for me to give a speech about theoretical ideas like situated knowledge or whether the self is fictional or autonomous or relational. I think what she wants is just for me to tell you a story, to tell you the story, as it were, of what I do and how this has changed over the years that I've been involved in the medical humanities. And from my story, as well as Chuck's, because that's what he was doing too, was telling you his story. From these stories about what we do, it should be apparent how literary scholars like us help our students and our physician colleagues develop and hone their narrative competence. So, my presentation this morning is really going to be in two parts. The first will concern my scholarship, particularly two of my books, which deal with patient narratives, and the second concerns teaching. And as I was writing the second part of this talk, it was interesting to me to see the extent to which the overarching themes and important issues that surfaced in the first section, the one about research, were really repeated in the second one that's about my teaching. Now, these themes then seem to me to constitute the through line of my presentation, and they are three. First, accessibility. The language that we use in the medical humanities in our writing and in our teaching when we deal with medical students and with doctors has to be clear and lucid. Though the discourse of medicine is full of Latinate terms and acronyms known only to the initiate, still medical personnel have little tolerance for jargon or obfuscating prose in the fields of the humanities. And second is usefulness. What we do in the medical humanities in our publications and in the classroom has to pass the so what test. It must in some way forge a connection between, on the one hand, literary works and literary theory, and on the other hand, real problems in the real world of doctors and patients. I'm reminded always of E.M. Forster's epigraph to Howard's End, only connect. Doctors are unlike academics in that they often deal with a very vulnerable and needy population. These are people who are sick and scared, who may be facing death, and the families of these people. Now, some of you may argue that in recent years, the Academy has become much more conscious of cultural problems and issues, especially in regard to issues of race, class, and gender. The important difference, though, is that in the academy, for the most part, these are ideological issues, whereas doctors deal with real people with real immediate needs and problems. So this is the preface, as it were, to my story. I think you'll find that these three themes, accessibility, usefulness, and ethical value. Oh, I forgot the ethical value. My third. Mustn't ever forget that. Invariably, what we do in the medical humanities has some connection to ethical issues and values. We aren't ethics, we aren't bioethics, but we're intimately connected with these kinds of issues. In this, medicine and nursing, too, are really very different from the academic professions. In most medical schools across the country, graduating students recite some version of the Hippocratic Oath. Now, think of how different this is from what happens when we graduate with a PhD in history or comparative literature or anthropology. Also, medical students have to take courses in medical professionalism, courses that explore the values of the profession. This is really different. In the past 20 years, there have been a number of formal statements about the values dimension of medical education. In 1981, the GPEP panel, which I think stands for General Professional Education of the Physician, this panel set forth a statement about the personal qualities, values, and attitudes that those pursuing careers in medicine should possess. I'm glad I never had to have that studied about me when I was in graduate school, particularly since that was the 60s. In 1999, the Medical Student Objectives Project Advisory Group came up with 4 attributes that medical students should possess when they graduate: altruism, knowledge, skill, and duty. And I think Rita was on the writing group that actually wrote this up. So now I can say, this is the preface to my story, now completed. And I think these themes will come up over and over throughout both parts of my presentation. These qualities don't substitute for or replace analysis and theory. Indeed, sound critical thinking is just as necessary in the medical humanities, in our scholarship, as it is in literary studies or philosophical analysis. The difference is that in the medical humanities, we need to go one step further, linking theory to practice and using an accessible prose style to do so. So, my story. It was nearly 20 years ago that I had one of those rare strokes of luck. I stumbled across a group of books that seemed to have eluded the gaze of literary critics. Back then, I was hard at work revising my dissertation into a book. The dissertation was about spiritual autobiographies. And on the personal side, I was dealing with the sequelae of my father's surgery from a ruptured cerebral aneurysm. And I think it was these two experiences together that made me notice some paperbacks in our supermarket's book section that really looked like they could have been narratives of religious conversion. Only they weren't. They were about physical sickness, not religious angst. And what they were autobiographies about the experience of illness. I found myself really fascinated by them, and I'm sure this fascination had something to do with a certain weariness in reading Calvin's Institutes and John Bunyan's Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, which is no page-turner. And of course it had to do with my recent experiences with hospitals and doctors during my father's surgery. And so my next book project was born. Perhaps I thought these autobiographies about illness might give us a valuable perspective on how patients experience illness and treatment in this country, and might provide information about attitudes and assumptions governing these experiences. Well, it took me a really long time to do this study, and when I finally finished it, it was published in 1993 as Reconstructing Illness, Studies in Pathography. And the book seems to have been pretty successful. Over the years, though, I've received a certain amount of flack from my literary colleagues because of the theoretical approach that I used in the book, which was that of archetypal criticism, dinosaurs, in other words. Even when I first thought about doing this book, I realized that this approach had pretty well become obsolete in academic circles. So I'd like to take this opportunity to explain why I chose it. First, my book about these autobiographies of illness, as I originally conceived it, was intended for an audience that would include the general reading public as well as fellow academics. I thought just maybe my book might be helpful for people experiencing illness, and I wanted to replicate in my own methodology what I saw as the concern of a great many pathographers, which was to do something in their writing that was at the same time therapeutic and altruistic. Therapeutic in that they enabled the author to deal better with his or her experience by the act of writing and also publishing the book, and altruistic in that they were intended to help readers with similar experiences. In reading these books, I was struck by the way certain themes were repeated over and over, and these themes became the myths of journey, battle, and rebirth that are the organizing structure of my own book. And the secondary sources that I found most useful in understanding what goes on when someone writes a book about their illness experience were Robert J. Lifton's studies of Hiroshima. In both Death and Life and The Broken Connection, Lifton writes about what he calls formulation, a reparative process that deals with trauma by imagination and interpretation. Formulation, he remarks, is a kind of psychic rebuilding, the construction of certain inner forms or configurations that function as a bridge between self and world, a psychological process whereby the suffering person returns to the world of the living. The writing of a pathography seemed to me a narrative development of this psychological act of formulation. And I'm sure in all this you can see the parallel to what Chuck Anderson was talking about earlier. Subsequent trauma scholars, at least some of them, appear to confirm and to develop Lifton's idea of formulation. Now, since we have among the panelists an authority on trauma literature, I would of course defer to his judgment as to whether these later scholars expand on Lifton's early work or whether they move in new directions. I think that Kali Tal, in her book on trauma literature, she seems to me to continue along the lines that Lifton laid out. She emphasizes the role of image in recovery. She writes, for the survivor, the traumatic experience is reinscribed as metaphor. A coping strategy shared by survivor and culture, she writes, is mythologization, hard word to pronounce, which works by reducing a traumatic event to a set of standardized narratives, end quote. Image, metaphor, myth, these seem to be the essential building blocks of formulation, and thus it is no surprise that they should be used extensively by authors of pathographies. In my own research, as Rita has noticed, I took great pains to read as many of these books as I could find. I worked through the Library of Congress catalog, where I discovered that there were more books in print than I had thought, many of them published by really obscure presses, and I mean really obscure. So I pestered our college librarian to find ways to borrow these books, and when this just wasn't possible, I just bought them. So I have a really great library of materials that you might not want to read. I don't want to say that, but but you know, they were wonderful in some ways, but they're not the kinds of books that you want to necessarily go back to time and time again. I recognized early on that certain pathographies were better written than others, and these most commonly were the ones whose authors were writers or journalists or academics or people who had some connection to the media world. But also, from very early on, I found that the books published by these small, little-known presses were just as interesting as the others. And I realized that the myths that had been fully articulated in the more writerly narratives, books like Oliver Sacks' description of his journey to hell and back in his book A Leg to Stand On, or like Cornelius Ryan's description of his war with cancer in his book A Private Battle, that these were also present in the less polished pathographies as narrative and imagistic threads. As it turned out, it was really hard for me to write a book that would appeal both to academics and to a general audience, and I'm sure a lot of you have had this kind of struggle. So what I did was to settle for an academic audience, though it was always my hope that the book would find its way to the general reader. And now I mention all this at such length because I think that this early wish to find a way for my work to engage a group that's broader than academics has not only left an indelible mark on this particular book, but it's also been a major characterizing feature in my career as a scholar and a teacher. Moreover, I think this approach is often characteristic of those of us who teach in medical schools. Did it precede my taking on a position in a medical school, or did it follow as a consequence of my being in such a setting? Well, probably both. I do think that those of us who seek to do academic work outside the academy often have the kind of hunger to connect their work to real problems in the real world. And it's certainly true that once you're at a medical school, the work an academic does is shaped by the real world concerns of medical practice. Perhaps it was my desire to reach the person behind the book, the author and not just the narrator, that was behind my interest in why people write books about an experience of illness. In my book, Reconstructing Illness, I suggested a taxonomy of pathography based upon what I had surmised as to why the author had written the book. There were the testimonial pathographies, angry pathographies, and alternative pathographies. The first, the category of testimonial pathography, accounts for the majority of books written early on. That's the 1960s and 70s. The intent of these authors seems to be to tell a straightforward story of the author's experience, focusing primarily on his or her thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are complementary to a medical treatment that's generally accepted as appropriate and helpful. Now remember, at this time, illness narratives were not nearly as plentiful as they are today. It seemed to me really remarkable that though these early authors had very few models of this kind of writing, still their works were really similar in very many ways. Many of them were written with the overstated purpose of helping others who undergo a similar experience, and thus they blend personal testimony with practical information. So, for example, one book is written explicitly for women with breast cancer who are considering whether to undergo surgical reconstruction. There's another concerned with the changes in lifestyle required by a husband's heart attack. And the prefatory comment of author Herbert Conley might represent the intent of these didactic pathographies. This book, he tells us, is written for all those who are presently walking a similar path. And then I found that the pathographies written somewhat later, near the end of the 70s, began to really change dramatically in tone and in intent. Trust in physicians and tolerance of hospital routines were no longer the norm, but now the exception. And so many books are characterized by a striking lack of confidence in physicians, an overt fear of hospitalization, and even a sense of betrayal, not so much by one's body as by our country's healthcare system. As author Sue Baer remarks, "I was no longer afraid of the disease, but of the system." Now, these later pathographies took two forms. Either they expressed anger at callous or needlessly depersonalizing medical treatment, or they veered off the beaten path to experiment with alternative medical therapies. Some 5 years after Reconstructing Illness came out, I was asked by my publisher to prepare a revised edition. And this was really neat because it meant that I could kind of go back and, I don't know, sort of cut and piece things that I wished that I had said and hadn't. But to do this, I had to read more pathographies, those that were published in the mid-90s. And I realized at that point that this earlier taxonomy had to be expanded. One enormous change was that there were now a lot of these books around. I mean, a whole lot. And so the more recent pathographies don't have the same tone of breaking new ground. Frequently, these authors have read other pathographies, and they often indicate in a preface how their book differs from whatever has been previously published. In some of these recent books, the illness is not one heretofore written about, such as conditions that are pretty common, like migraine or stuttering or asthma, or conditions that are really extreme, like locked-in syndrome or end-stage respirator-dependent ALS. Recent pathographies interested me that they're still very illness-specific, even to the extent of organizing the book around the comparison of one illness and how patients respond to it to another. For example, authors of recent books about prostate cancer often indicate that they were motivated to write because they observed similarities between their experience and that of women who wrote about breast cancer. In some of these narratives, the author describes coping strategies taken directly from breast cancer survivors, while at the same time indulging in a kind of self-reflexive machismo. And I won't give you examples here, they're rather bawdy. Also, humor is a really new territory explored by recent books, and the titles are wonderful. There's one called Sweet Pea, the Autobiography of a Diabetic, or Sweet Pea. Or there's the homely humor of Lewis Grizzard, writing about valve replacement surgery in a book called I Took a Lickin' and Kept on Tickin'. Or there are outrageous titles like quadriplegic John Callahan's Don't Worry, He Won't Get Far on Foot. And Fanny Gaines has written an Erica Young-like book about breast cancer called How Am I Going to Find a Man If I'm Dead? Well, there are a number of these. all these recent narratives to me, especially the humor, it demonstrate that the genre itself is changed by a kind of authorial self-consciousness about the genre itself. One characteristic of these narratives about illness that's tended to remain the same over time is their independence of postmodern understandings of the self and postmodern interrogation of meaning. And I don't know where David Morris is right now, and I'm sure he will object to this, and I'll be interested to hear what he says. I think, despite postmodern and deconstructive questioning of the validity of the concept of self, narratives about personal illness enjoy a credibility and unmistakable sense of the real. Of course, there are exceptions to this generalization, but not a lot. The one exception I can think of is Eve Sedgwick's dialogue on love, which really is a postmodern pathography. But for the most part, autobiographies of illness tend to convey the coherence of a life conceived as a story, as an ongoing narrative, and one wherein the meaning of the experience is a function of a particular diagnostic category. It's curious that at a time when postmodern approaches dominate the academy, that pathography, like other forms of life writing, is so popular among general readers. Tom Kuser, in his book Recovering Bodies, writes about this. Illness narratives, he writes, tell more or less straightforward stories and tend to perpetuate pre-modernist narrative conventions. Kuser explains the appeal and popularity of pathography, which he calls autopathography, by suggesting that its old-fashioned plot, vivid characters, life and death crises, definite closure, may satisfy general readers in a way that other kinds of contemporary literature, with its minimalism and its self-reflective postmodernist conventions, do not. So for the revised version of my book, I wrote a new preface as well as a new chapter. Of course, there was a lot to say about changes in the field since the first publication. Tom Kuser and Art Frank had published their books during this period of time, and lots of people were publishing articles all over the place. But the only really serious mistake I felt that I had made in the first edition was to tend to gloss over pathographies written out of a religious stance. And this seems ironic, given that the book that directly preceded this was about religious conversion. This, however, is the one area, this is the issue of religion, in which my being situated at an academic medical center or any medical center has really changed my perspective. Since my book was first published, I've learned from patients and families and doctors how powerful religious belief can be in confronting not just serious illness itself, but also all the problems that go with it. Now, religious pathographies are worth reading very carefully. Though most are published by small denominational presses, they're more plentiful than one could imagine, and they offer an important corrective to the angry outcry or the alternative bypath. Many of them are quite beautiful and really moving, even for readers like myself who are not religious in the same way. These narratives testify to the experience of fear and pain and the search to find meaning in these experiences, and they demonstrate the powerful impact of a supportive community as well as an attempt to find healing in prayer. I'd like to turn now rather abruptly to my recent book, which is different in many ways from Reconstructing Illness. It focuses on real people, not their books, and it's a trade book, published by W.W. Norton and intended for a popular audience. The book is called A Small Good Thing, Stories About Children with HIV and Those Who Care for Them. The publisher's title, not mine. The book consists of 6 chapters, each telling the story of one of the families in our clinic. The book is no longer available from the publisher, but if you'd like a copy, I can sell you one for $15, which is a discounted amount, and I will mail it to you. And you should know that all proceeds from the sale of this book go directly to the families about which I write. In order to write the book, I spent 3 years attending our hospital's pediatric HIV clinic. I got to know the children and their families and the medical staff. I was surprised that in everything that has been written about this disease, so little notice has been taken of children born with HIV in this country. So it seemed to me this was a book that just had to be written. I thought it would be a way to draw attention to the unique problems and issues that these children experience. And I wanted to celebrate the families as well as the other caregivers who gave so much of themselves to make a good life for these children. Writing a book taught me a whole lot about life writing in general. First, the thorny question about boundaries between author and subject. Whose stories were these? I used taped interviews from various people involved in the lives of these children and some from the children themselves. but invariably the stories were changed in the way I told them in my writing. And throughout, I felt a strong tension between a fidelity to the text of the interviews and the need to edit them to produce a clearer and more coherent narrative. In addition, I realized that my telling of these stories was conditioned by how I understood what I witnessed and was told, and that this was an understanding shaped by who I am, my goals and values and experiences and needs. So I tried to be transparent about my position as author. I was anything but dispassionate and objective. Instead, as I indicated in the book's preface, I was an involved and sometimes passionately involved participant for 3 years in some aspect of the lives of these families. Another issue for me in writing this book was how I should incorporate my background as a literary scholar, which played so large a part in my understanding of these stories. And by literary background, I refer not to theoretical issues about life writing, but to specific literary works that I have read and taught and written about so often that they've really become a part of me. Over and over, I return to Greek tragedy. However removed in culture and historical time, it has always helped me understand what I see. In particular, I was reminded of Sophocles' Philoctetes, with its depiction of suffering and its analysis of what it means to witness another's suffering and the moral obligation that this incurs. I found Camus' The Plague, itself a great work of moral fiction, extremely helpful. Dr. Rieu's remark that the only means of fighting a plague is common decency, doing my job, seemed suddenly to be one of the most profound comments about living responsibly that I had ever encountered. However, the most important issue for me in writing this book, and this issue continues well past the book's publication, has to do with the way I deal with the obligations I incurred by entering into the lives of these children and their families in this way. I came to realize that in the process of learning about their lives and using information about their lives in my book, I was inevitably forming personal relationships with each of them, and that these relationships entailed wider obligations. So I tried then, and I still try now, to honor these obligations in whatever way I can. I intervene for parents when they have trouble getting in touch with the clinic physician. I give money when money is needed. I try to keep in touch with the children and their families when they come into the clinic. My affiliation with the clinic has been, and continues to be, a wonderful, rich, and extremely humbling experience. There really is very little that I can do for them. And now I'm going to I couldn't find a transition sentence, so I'm going to go immediately to I even wrote transition sentence. So this is the second part of my talk concerns teaching. Teaching in medical school humanities programs, I think, is very similar from school to school. It's not the same, but there's a certain amount of similarity when schools have medical humanities departments. And so to some extent, I think I speak for those of us here who do this. Anne Hudson-Jones, Suzanne Poirier, Marcia Day Childress, Lois Nixon, and I'm sure there are others that I haven't met yet to talk with. I'm involved in several kinds of teaching. I give small group seminars on a particular subject. My courses inevitably have to do with literature in some way and have titles like Cancer and the Patient's Experience, or Medical Ethics in Literature, or sometimes just the generic Readings in Literature and Medicine, which lets me substitute things up to the last minute. That's what I like. I'm also the director of a humanities core course for first-year students. And this is somewhat like the Introduction to Literature surveys that are offered in colleges and universities. It's a kind of overview course. This course lasts for 12 weeks, and it consists of 1 hour of large group discussion, of large group lectures for about 130 students. And usually these are not lectures, they are patients who come in to tell their stories, or other kinds of persons. And this is followed by an hour of small group discussion. These discussion groups are made up of about 15 or 16 students each, and they're led by humanities faculty alongside clinician colleagues who express an interest in teaching with us. The course themes are the patient's experience of illness, cultural issues in medical practice, and how medical education is itself a process of initiation into the culture of medicine. If any of you are interested in the syllabus of this course, I brought copies. The readings for the course include a lot of literature. Probably that has something to do with my being the director, but I'd like to think that anybody would choose to include a lot of literature. I find it really interesting that for the past few years running, the course evaluations indicate that the student's favorite text is Kafka's Metamorphosis. Well, some students have read it before, but most of them haven't, and most of them are a little thrown by it. We use the story to discuss the way patients experience certain kinds of illnesses, the effect on family members and the impact on medical caregivers or family caregivers of taking care of a loved one or a patient who is severely disabled. Students always start off by seeing an analogy between Gregor's situation and conditions like Alzheimer's or locked-in syndrome. Then they kind of move on to conditions like stroke or cancer and its treatment, more common conditions. And invariably, some student, the light bulb will go off, and they'll see a frightening analogy with the possible effects on them of their socialization into the culture of medicine. Oh, I'm going to wake up one morning like Gregor Samson. That's what my medical education is going to do to me. Also, the metamorphosis proves to be wonderfully helpful in teaching point of view. It's important that the story is told from Gregor's point of view, even after he dies. And a writing exercise we sometimes give our students is to try to write the story from the point of view of one of the other characters, the charwoman or the sister. It's a very different story. Other narrative texts in this course include excerpts from autobiographies of illness by patients, Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich or Wendell Berry's Fidelity, Ethan Canaan's We Are Nighttime Travelers, and a whole lot of poetry. And the poetry is not just decoration. In fact, we make a point of urging faculty to work the assigned poem into the class discussion. Last year, we included a poem as an exam question, asking students to comment on some of the major course themes as presented in the poem. And there's a writing component to the course, which the students hate, in addition to the final exam. We require weekly writing exercises on the readings. One of these, usually for the session on aging, asks the students to find an image in the readings and to comment on how appropriate it is to the course topic. You'd be surprised at what students think an image is, many of them. Another exercise, usually for our session about dying, asks the students to come up with an image and then write a poem or a story using the image. And most of the students write poems. I'm always a little surprised at how much the students seem to enjoy the creative writing exercises, even when they complain about it, which they always do. So what's the value of a student writing a poem? Well, it appeals to their imaginative faculties, which are really sorely neglected in medical school training. It also involves them deeply in the theme about which they're writing, and this is an important antidote to the general pattern in medical school of trying to objectify everything one learns. It's important to remember that these small group discussion sections are taught mostly by doctors. In fact, the dean of the medical school is a small group discussion leader in our first year course. This is the one I've just described. We have a planning session before each course session that's required of all teaching staff, even the dean. And these meetings are important because they serve as a kind of classroom for our faculty clinicians. For example, our clinician faculty are often uncomfortable about teaching the metamorphoses. So I provide instructors with a whole lot of teaching tools, handouts that include information about Kafka and the story, a set of questions that they might raise with students, and teaching comments that I've collected over the years from faculty who have done this before. Now, teaching a poem poses a different kind of problem, since clinicians who aren't familiar with poetry will often tend to teach it in the same way that they would a prose work. So early on in our planning session, I talk about what works for me in teaching poetry. And in fact, over the years, I've put together a method for how to teach poetry to medical students, and this is what I provide to my course faculty. And I have to confess here that what I call my approach to teaching poetry is really taken from Chuck Anderson. And I have a feeling that this workshop that he's going to do is precisely the workshop I sat in on, 10, 15 years ago, and that's really the basis for how I teach medical students poetry. So let me show you what I do. I start off by suggesting that reading a poem is really very similar to what students have learned about conducting a patient interview. And these are first-year students. I tell them that there are several stages to reading a poem, just as there are several stages in a patient interview. The first stage is just to sit back and let the poem speak to you. In the same way that you would ask a patient an open-ended question to elicit their story, so also you just let the poem speak to you. What do you notice? What images or words stand out? What don't you understand? The skill called for in this first stage is really a kind of watchful attentiveness. I tell them you should read the poem over several times, each time marking words or images that catch your attention. Just sort of underline them. And when you've done this, then sit back and lightly, without trying to pin anything down, just guess at some of the major themes and concerns, writing down 1 or 2 or 3 words for each. So this is the first stage, the receptive stage. The second stage involves a more active interrogation of the poem, and I tell them this is like the second stage in a medical interview, when you ask the patient direct questions. Have you had any hospitalizations? Is there anything you do that makes the pain better or worse? It's in this stage of reading the poem that you look for image patterns and analyze structure and ask about the speaker and the title and all that. And the concluding stage, the third stage, is to write down in 1 sentence the poem's actual meaning. The students invariably notice how inadequate this or any meaning is to their experience of the poem. And then I can point out how the similarity to a patient, the great similarity to a patient encounter. And the diagnosis here is like the meaning, and it's totally different from their experience of the patient in front of them. Our interactions as humanities faculty in this course with clinicians, I think, are just as important or more so than our interactions with medical students. Plus, it's just really fun to talk with doctors about literature. And sometimes I think that the academy, that the love of literature exists more in a medical school faculty almost than it does in a literature department. But I haven't been there for many years. For years, I've offered faculty seminars in literature for our hospital's clinicians. And for me, these have been the high point of my teaching experience. Doctors always complete their reading assignments. Always. Indeed, they tend to be a little obsessive about this. And also, they bring to their understanding of any text a wealth of experiences in observing and helping patients deal with suffering and fear and hope and joy and you name it. The first course I taught was a kind of overview of texts, either that I just liked or that had been successful with my students. And because I didn't know what would work, I just included a little bit of everything. So my doctor students read ancient works in translation as well as contemporary stories. This first course was supported by an NEH grant, and I remember Rita coming to my class on the Bacchae as an NEH evaluator. And my students that year included the chair of general surgery, a family medicine doc who was in charge of the interviewing course required of all first-year students, a famous endocrinologist who boasts of being Kennedy's doctor. I was never sure which Kennedy. And a pediatrician who was the head of the hospital ethics committee, a cardiologist who was the dean of students, the chair of the Department of Pastoral Services, and so forth. It was a really stellar group. This first course was so successful and so much fun for me that I kept on offering these faculty seminars in subsequent years. There was a seminar on just Homer's Iliad, about which I am passionate. And there was a course on Shakespeare's plays, with each play accompanied by a film. During a really difficult time at our medical center when we were going through a merger with another hospital system, and a business ethic was really threatening the values and ideals of the institution, I gave a course that I called The Individual, the Institution, and the Powers That Be. We read the Aeneid, and we discussed the tragic choices that physicians are sometimes forced to make. And we talked about fate and inevitability and the place of ideals in one's life, and we also talked a whole lot about anger. We read The Plague, and we discussed it in terms of how to do one's job at a time of institutional and political plague when the ideals and values of the profession seemed to be expendable. There's so much more that I could say about the way narrative and narrative approaches are incorporated into medical education, and it's getting well on, and I want there to be time for discussion. So I'm going to just mention one more example, because I think it ties in very well with both with Chuck's presentation as well with some of the comments afterwards. And this is our medical school's literary journal. It comes out annually. It's edited mostly by students, and it includes poems and stories by people connected in a great many ways to the medical center, nurses and physicians and students and patients and families. My point in mentioning the literary journal is that narrative competence doesn't always require analysis. There are many physicians and students who might shy away from talking about the meaning of a story or poem, but they will readily write stories and poems and write them to be read out loud in front of others. At the end of the year, we have a reception honoring those who write and those who are the subjects of these writings. In fact, it's coming up next week. Authors are invited to read their works and maybe say a little bit about them. Each year, there is some very moving story or poem by a physician about a patient. Inevitably, the patient attends the reception, often with family members. And the story or poem read by the physician is a way in which he or she publicly acknowledges the close bond that's developed with the patient. And this public acknowledgement of that connection is, I think, the final action that completes the story they've shared. It's clearly a kind of narrative competence that's been achieved. In conclusion, I hope my comments will serve as a kind of window, albeit from my own perspective, onto the work of humanities scholars who are situated in medical schools. I think many of us are impelled to do what we do in our research and our teaching by a strong wish to bring literature and literary theory into a creative, dynamic relationship with the real-world problems of medical practice and the real-life situations of caregivers, students, and patients. Donna Haraway says this more eloquently than I ever could, so I'd like to end by paraphrasing and quoting a passage from Situated Knowledges. She writes, "I think my problem and our problem is how to have simultaneously a recognition of the historical contingency of knowledge and meaning and a no-nonsense commitment to faithful accounts of a real world, one that can be partially shared and that is friendly to earth-wide projects of finite freedom, adequate material abundance, modest meaning and suffering, and a limited happiness." Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Dr. Stephen Shea was to be the respondent for Anne's paper. Dr. Shea is the Division of General Medicine Chief at Columbia. His father-in-law died, and he is at a funeral. Dr. Jeffrey Borkman has happily agreed to be a respondent in Dr. Shea's place. Dr. Borkman is the chair of the Department of Family Medicine at Brown University. Dr. Borkman not only is a family physician, is an eloquent writer, has brought to us collections of the stories that physicians, nurses, and social workers have written about their patients. Dr. Borkman.
Well, it's an honor to be a discussant for Professor Hawkins' paper. I remember reading her work on pathography soon after it came out and being awed by the logic of it, how she discerned insightful patterns among those books found more commonly in the lines at supermarkets or the drugstore paperback racks than in university libraries. There's something so appealing about finding meaning among things that eluded the gaze of literary critics. I'm also pleased to be a discussant, having spent the last nearly 2 decades researching, teaching, writing, experiencing patient and physician stories, both as a family physician and a medical anthropologist in the United States and Israel. Regarding the first part of her paper on autobiographical narratives about illness, the patterns which she found in the pathographies seem to display certain Western choreographed construction, whether we're talking about testimonials, angry alternative narratives, or self-reflexive narratives, how different they are than the taxonomies of physician stories. And this is whether we look to Arthur Frank's work about the restitution, quest, or chaos narratives, or one of her Penn State colleagues, Will Miller, who sees routines, ceremonies, and dramas in all primary care visits. One characteristic of most of the pathographies, and after reading her book, we began to give them out to our patients in Family Practice Center, is that they tend to convey the coherence of a life conceived as story, as an ongoing narrative. Illness narrative construction remains and will likely always remain a search for meaning, a way of making sense of often chaotic, frightening, and painful experiences, as Anne mentioned. The lens may change, religion, anger, complementary alternative medicine, socialism, but I wonder if it perhaps is unlikely if it really alters the basic structure. I'd enjoy hearing more about that. Anne's newest book on stories about children with HIV strikes me as a break from her previous efforts, not just in terms of the movement away from accounts written by patients to accounts written by interviewers. It's a switch into witnessing, something we're going to hear more about. The recording of another's suffering as an act of documentation that provides the sufferer with recognition and dignity. In this case, as Anne mentions, so little notice had been taken of these children born with HIV, so it seemed to me that this book just needed to be written. Such witnessing is the stuff of everyday health care in its most banal form. The outpatient or hospital record may be the only chart, the only narrative record that someone leaves their whole life. But it becomes more dramatic when we think of the witnessing of the Nuremberg trials after World War II, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, the forensic anthropological work in Bosnia or El Salvador, or the stories of torture. Our witnessing and retelling accounts is part of the paying back of the obligation, so that the generations will follow will know the story. Anne spoke of the issue of responsibility to families. It resonates with the issue of responsibilities to informants in anthropology. Do we exploit our patients by writing about them, or do we celebrate them through our witnessing? Always remember, I was a family doctor in a remote area of Israel for 10 years, and the people knew I was doing a lot of writing, and one small group who agreed to let me in said, by the way, we're happy to have you take care of us, just don't write about us. Anne spoke about the difficulties about life writing in general. This is the challenge for the nonfiction writer, the biographer, the ethnographer. The real issues regard whose voice are you giving life to anyway, the boundaries between author and subject, and the influences of our backgrounds. In anthropology, we are taught early on that there is no objective, no transparency. Everything is influenced by the culture of the observer through the lens of the writer, who cannot be separated from the account any more than separated from the context. Her role as writer, medieval scholar, and mother of 3 growing children, as I discovered on a phone call yesterday, are inseparable from her account. Although these realizations have, in the last 2 decades, led to some postmodernist paralysis of self-doubt among my colleagues in anthropology, they bring all of us to realize what Anne gained through hard experience. There is no dispassionate. Our various backgrounds flavor and structure our interpretations. In this case, her background as a literary scholar, it's a good flavor. I'm just glad she wasn't an accountant. About medical education, part 2 of the paper. First of all, I salute Anne's and the rest of your efforts to do these kinds of activities. And the success at her penetrance into the core and culture of the medical school, having a chair of surgery and a dean take part, is a huge step forward. Her program at Penn State goes beyond most efforts at narrative teaching and breaks through the real and artificial borders that keep us within the confines of our academic turf. In my opinion, and I know that Anne has helped to edit a book on this topic, which I reread on the train yesterday, I think that as teachers of narrative, we can likely have impact in a few ways. First of all, as she mentioned, we can provide accessibility, usability, and ethics. I would actually put the emphasis on usability. We can provide transcendence, those aha moments from reading Metamorphosis or The Death of Ivan Ilyich or Campo's poems that forever change the reader. Perhaps we can immunize our students against cynicism. The day before yesterday, I was giving the last class, and I told my students in a course that I teach on narrative as medicine and medicine as narrative, that this course will hopefully immunize them against the cynicism of medical school and residency training and help them to hear their own stories and the stories of their patients. Inshallah. God can only hope. And perhaps it can provide integration between the humanities, the preclinical and the clinical, making it all part of medicine and doctoring. Anne didn't give an example, which I saw in her talk, that she provides a rich case history exercise, which is then compared by the students to the medical records in the records room. This is really flawless. Prior to becoming chair at Brown, I championed the concept of seamlessness at Tel Aviv Medical School and in a curriculum reform there, where we tried to deconstruct boundaries between clinical and preclinical, hard and soft science, and create integrated developmental evolutionary spirals that defied the old labels, trying to become post-Flexnerian. Those students followed families and tried to integrate illness over the course of time, and one of the exercises learning all the communication, pathophysiology, and anatomy, and narrative competence skills needed to understand them, the students, and themselves in the fuller context. But the ultimate goal, in my opinion, is to improve medicine by assisting in reducing suffering, producing what maybe arrogantly can be called best medicine. What's that best medicine? Well, I believe it's merging physician and patient stories to negotiate them in a manner which is reminiscent of Arthur Kleinman's negotiation of explanatory models. But going beyond this and adding to our stories and our patient stories the best evidence, i.e. evidence-based medicine, plus mindfulness, which some call as judgment and professionalism. Colleagues and I have only half-kiddingly noted that the goal of all of this is to create physicians who are human beings. Thus, our model that pulled together patient narratives, physician narratives, and the best evidence is labeled Mindful Evidentiary Narrative-Centered Healthcare. MENCH, MENCH. Anne's paper certainly provides the background and impetus for further developments in this area and a window to the future. Thank you.
We'll take a good half hour for questions. Please.
Hi, I'm Mark Silverberg. I'm an English professor. And your talk seemed to raise the question of intention again that
Yes.
we were discussing last time. And I'm interested, I guess the kind of texts that I'm interested in are pathographies maybe without intention. I'm thinking of the poetry of Sylvia Plath or Emily Dickinson, Frida Kahlo's painting, things that, texts that are about pain but have no intention to be altruistic. And I guess I'm wondering from you or any of the initial speakers about how those kind of texts fit with the idea of a healing narrative. Obviously, or was Plath's, can we think of Plath's work as being healing for her? I think of Plath's work as being healing probably for others, the number of people who respond to it. So I'm just that's the question.
I wonder whether Chuck might be better answering this, though. Well, it's the same reason that the metamorphosis works in teaching. Sometimes that patient narratives don't. I mean, if you get a little bit distance and you have a more of an artistic filter, sometimes there's more room for the reader or the listener to respond to it and to fill those things in. I found that it's interesting, in my faculty seminars, the only thing they don't want to read is stuff about medicine. And they don't want to read the patient narratives. They don't want to read any of it. And yet what they talk about is their patients and their work. So I think that's a short answer. I don't know but I think that may be part of what's going on.
I just nailed someone in the audience who's going to help us answer this. Robert Sember is an anthropologist at the School of Public Health.
Thank you, Rita. I don't know if I'm going to nail this. What I actually like to do is to invite a little more explicit discussion about the politics of this project, of the conjunction of narrative and medicine that I think is incipient, particularly in this conversation. But I think from the moment that you began the introduction, Rita, was there as well. The politics of the establishment of the field, the sort of disciplinary issues that are involved in that, the epistemological issues, and also the politics of change that Chuck was drawing attention to. I think of the fact that when Eric Marcus was talking about medicine as a culture, and as a culture, therefore, it has a power system, and there are unequal positions of power. And it's in the context of those power relations that these narratives are being solicited and are being circulated. And to what extent are we at all interested in actually intervening in that power structure and that power system? What's the politics of that in some way? And also the extent to which narrative itself can be enormously conservative, in that it also, to use a term that Eric Marcus introduced, it integrates. And what is it being integrated into? As an anthropologist, I reflect on the very limited success that the movement of the past couple of decades towards bringing in cultural competence into the public health system and the medical system has actually had. And there's an essay by Michael Hunsaker that I think has been enormously influential in critiquing the championing of cultural competence. The title of the essay is Reification and Consciousness of the Patient, where he says, in a sense, what happens is simply the experience of the patient becomes appropriated into the existing power system, and it becomes another way in which the biomedical model can intervene in yet another aspect of the patient's experience. Now, by no means do I think that that's the only thing that's happening, but I think it's one of the issues that gets raised by the contextual systemic factors within which this project of narrative medicine is being undertaken. And I'm hearing that's bubbling below the surface, that those issues, that sort of sensitive politics of this, and I'd love to hear some more about it.
Yes.
Could I just respond to that?
Please.
Just very briefly in saying that certainly the biggest problem of what we're doing is that we do recreate the power structures and we do appropriate. One of the aspects that's been so powerful for narrative, I think, though, in medicine, and I'm coming really not from the literary side, is that it gives voice to patients. And that is not certainly the panacea, but it's an incredible improvement over what was present prior to that.
Yes, Lois?
Lois Nixon, University of South Florida. This conference is very exciting, I think, because it has so many partnerships. The College of Medicine, in our opinion, at our college, at our university, is that it's part of the university, is a short point, and that all the resources should be used. And increasingly, I think that there is that change occurring in medical schools, that they are looking across campus to people that they didn't include before. In terms of Anne's inclusion of so many faculty, or her ability to reach faculty, senior faculty, you talked about the students, and then you jumped to the senior faculty. That's a tremendous honor. That's a different kind of medical license that is given to the younger people that were talked about by Chuck, and the culture, the human culture. And as soon as you have grown-up faculty reading the kinds of books that you were talking about, or realizing with the students that when a humanities professor presented 10 years ago, some Frida Kahlo paintings, and then the film comes out, it's kind of like an endorsement. Oh, she was right all along. Boy, that's a good thing to be doing. Or when a film like The Hours, or about Schmidt, can be discussed with the chairman of psychiatry, for instance, that underscores the importance of humanities and works toward a more level playing field. I think that's occurring, and I think it's the job of all of us to make sure that when we do presentations in grand rounds or elsewhere, that we bring out our physician colleagues, but also someone from the theater, someone from communications. The broader that we can make the inclusion, I think the stronger we're going to be in the future. And I think we're seeing some of that today.
Right.
It's a very nice conference.
Right. But let's try to continue looking at the potential for exploitation, the potential for replacing that which ought be a patient's experience with one that's now mediated by the person who's in power anyway. Please. Professor Rimon-Kennan.
Yeah, I come from Jerusalem. I'm from literature and archaeology. I want to ask you a question which I think seems to be in line with this, about the term pathology, which worried me ever since I read your book. Doesn't this term clash with your desire, which you expressed explicitly, to reach the person behind the illness? Doesn't the term pathology run the risk of reducing a person who is also ill to a patient, and therefore appropriate to this case of
This is the term itself?
term.
Is that it?
Yeah,
Okay.
the pathography, the pathology,
Well, I mean, the term really comes from autobiography, pathography. Also, remember, I love Greek literature, and so it's a sort of natural for me. The other thing, why I like the term is because pathos in Greek literature means not only disease, but it means suffering. And it's wonderful that it brings both of them together. I think the problem with illness narrative is that it can be spoken narrative, it's really a broader term. And I think there's something different happens when someone sits down and writes the story of their experience, writes an autobiography. And lots of people, James Olney, others who are here, have observed this. And I think I was trying to kind of, piggyback onto that tradition and see these as a different kind of life writing. And that's I guess those are my reasons for the choice of the term.
Please, Mary.
My name is Mary Engel. I teach undergraduates and I run a pre-med program. And right now I teach a course called Perspective in Literature about Illness. And I dreamed this up because of Anne. Thank you, Anne. The very first assignment that these students have is they need to describe a healthcare setting. It may be one in which they received care, in which they were part of a healthcare team, or in which they took someone else to receive care. That's the only assignment that they get. What astonished us is over 90% of their descriptions were extremely negative. These are people, most of whom want to become doctors. And so I found so powerful, and they did, the fact that they just ran around like a bunch of sheep doing what their doctors told them and not questioning. And the fact that they want to become physicians just hit them like a ton of And so they did that as they were then also going to read a great deal of work written by doctors, by nurses, and by patients. And it has changed so much the way they look at their career. And so I think that that's an important part of the story of pathography, is that a patient has obviously reflected upon an experience that many patients don't privilege. And if we, even in the way that we look at our own lives as patients or as caregivers of patients or as accompaniers of patients, it's a kind of thing that in fact privileges the patient. I used to joke with my father when he went to see his oncologist. He said, I can never get him to give me more than 70 seconds, and it costs $900. And I said, Daddy, I can make him give you 5 minutes. And I wanted to say to this oncologist, this man led battalions. He's the greatest daddy in the world. Start looking at him. Don't give him 13 seconds to describe how he's going to die.
Please.
My name is Vinny Hever, and I teach undergraduates, and I want to follow up actually on some things. I teach an undergraduate seminar in narrative and psychology, and one of the writing exercises is to write about a difficult experience. Most students always choose something about medicine, something about family illness. And almost the thing that's been striking me very powerfully is they almost inevitably talk in negative ways about the experience of entering into the medical system. Their comments about physicians, comments about healthcare givers is certainly not, I'm sure, what healthcare givers want. At the same time, I've heard several speakers here talk about medical students finding themselves perhaps waking up into being trapped in a system that they are uncomfortable with. And I'm wondering if one of the themes that seems to be coming up is the interest of physicians in this field in trying to understand, have their position changed, say in the last 20 or 30 years, where they themselves no longer, in a sense, are the masters of their own universe, but themselves are being subject to some of the same forces patients are, and that the return to narrative is trying to find a way of understanding their situation and trying to find some way of empowering themselves to do something differently.
Jeff?
No, it's an interesting thesis. I mean, one would have to ask, why is there this awakening of interest? Because in the same way that the pathographies were quite rare 10 or 15 years ago, one of the reasons why we began to put together a book of primary care physician stories is there really weren't that many stories out there. So it's a fascinating question.
Professor LeCapra.
Yeah, I think that we're starting to get questions now from people who are not within the framework of narrative medicine. And I think that's interesting because I think one of the problems of this conference is really how to work out modes of communication that don't eliminate difficulties, but in some sense try to go through the difficulties. From the outside, it seems that narrative medicine as a project seems to be in certain ways an attempt to reintroduce something like bedside manner in a very professionalized context where people no longer visit the doctor, no longer visits the home of the patient. And so this modality of affect, empathy, attentiveness has to, in some sense, find another venue. And I think that the focus on narrative and the healing dimensions of narrative is one way of doing it, which is rather interesting, seeing from a distance. I think that one issue that's evolved, that's emerged, is that narrative, for anybody who studies narrative, is extremely complex. One of the interesting things about modern narrative is the introduction of so-called non-narrative elements to the narrative, if by narrative you mean a very traditional narrative that reaches closure, gives some touchy-feely sense of well-being and so forth. That much modern narrative really resists meaning in that sense. And I think that one of the interests of doing that is that it may in some sense resonate with trauma and traumatic symptoms more than a healing narrative that really seems to gloss over issues and not really to engage them. And I think that's one of the senses I think that people are trying to express. And the last thing I'll say, and simply stop there, is that I think that the larger context is important, and the extent to which narrative medicine can possibly function as a placebo in a health system which is incredibly unjust, where the healthcare delivery system is so inadequate to solve. These are just obvious things.
Indeed. Don.
Don Collis from stand?
You can stand over here, Don. Just come on up here.
I want to just touch on this appropriation of the patient's story
Yeah.
by the writer.
And now turn around.
Which worries me, but also to touch on the power of fiction and poetry as part of an explanatory model. I wrote a short story based just in a small part on the life of some patients I knew. And I was nervous about publishing the story, so I took this woman to lunch, after I had her read my story, to ask her what she thought of it. And I made up out of whole cloth sort of an explanation for why her first husband divorced her. And she thanked me for explaining it. And I was just so boggled by this. It was a story, but also was a question about the power of metaphors as an explanatory model. I stole her story, but then I altered it in a way that made it more whole somehow.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chuck. Please.
I want to be real clear about one thing. Healing narrative. One of the difficulties that we had this semester, as I knew this conference was coming, was very intentional about sort of pushing at it. And
Dr. LaCapra.
yeah, I want to be real clear. Healing narrative, it's really not a good idea to put an S on that. To treat it as though it were a thing. Healing narrative does not gloss over. Healing narrative does not suture up and make nice whole cloth out of human experience. Healing narrative is a very complex narrative process that is much more akin to the sort of postmodern kind of breakdown of the intention
Right.
to try to freeze things in place. And it is very related to traumatic experience, which consistently comes back to the center, comes back to, and will create a story that will, for this minute, satisfy. And then 5 minutes later, here come all the same issues one more time. So it's not a suturing up. It's not a final sort of coherent making sense of, but it's an integration of experience and a multiplication of the self. Not a shutting down of the self, but the self is remultiplied so that it does have that kind of diversity, so that it has a multitude of different kind of narrative competencies to come. But I really don't want the idea that healing narrative is a thing. It's not a thing. It's a process that people engage in at a certain time. I think the reason that it's emerging in medicine now is exactly for the reasons that I talked about in the entropic and the homeostatic conflict. I think medicine isn't working. I think what we're doing
That's right.
just doesn't work. And so this kind of narrative emergence is simply what healing narrative does. It's how we deal with situations that simply don't work, where we can't survive. We can't live in the system that we have. And the answer to the power question is you be subversive. You go underground.
Rebecca.
I think it's important to start defining narrative medicine. I think that's what this conference is about. And I think we need to think about how many different subjects of narrative medicine there are in the sense of subjects of study and analysis and in the sense of those who are practicing it. I think it's interesting that we've talked so much about narratives that heal the suffering of physicians and medical students because the most obvious suffering that we think of healing in the context of medicine is that of the patient.
Right.
And do we have any patient advocates here in the conference? We have a
Yes.
couple, and I asked you to speak up at some point during the conference because usually what's left out in these academic organizations is the patient, the voice of the patient. And that's what's represented in the text or the testimony. And I think that's another, so we're talking about the power of relations that Robert Semper brought up with the doctors, the medical students, the structure of medicine within which the patient's narrative can be subsumed, even in a culturally sensitive sort of ideology like cultural competence, but which the patient can dismiss through alternative medicines or abandoning the medical system, which is why we need narrative medicine. But we need to think also in a complex and careful and maybe for a simplistic way about the differences between testimonies that are transcribed
Please.
My name is Dr. Kathy Welch, and I tend to be a frank person. I've been working with Dr. Marjorie Sears for the last 10 years. With a very unique medical system in that courses are interdisciplinary, and not only medical people, but nursing students and others are all involved in it. I just got back also from Washington, D.C., the Society for Arts and Healthcare, in the interest of actually implementing actual things like writing and artwork within hospitals so that you're actually having what we do, or narrative as you will call it, in there. And I think it's important to talk about the reality of where we're at. I've been involved in this field for 12 years. I did a qualitative ethnographic study looking at writing and what its effect was on medical students. And then here we are simultaneously at a point where just 2 weeks ago I was sitting in to defend a student from a certain religious denomination. And the only criteria by which he is potentially going to be kicked out of medical school is one qualitative subjective grid of what is his professional competency. And you have us sitting here, Dr. Anderson said it superbly, I'm an English tutor, I'm a writing teacher, I just finished meeting with medical students this semester, and I said my main goal is to confuse the hell out of you. That's what I want to do, because you have such clear dichotomous thinking, and I want you to be realizing that life is extremely complicated. Yet you have a medical institution with a long history that says, let us criterize who is self-integrated thinkers, who has self-created knowledge, how do you quantify somebody's professional competence, how do you quantify if somebody's humanistic, how do you quantify if somebody's altruistic. So in a small, limited way, I think what we're doing is powerful, but we're up against an institution that constantly says, let's simplify this, let's put it in a grid,
Right.
and in the very grid, exactly like you perfectly said, medical students and the patients are both being abused by a system that has its potential good, and the doctors, quite frankly, get tired of hearing about cultural competency because everyone throws all of these labels at them that don't necessarily articulate their own complicated experience. So they themselves feel violated by being judged by complex structures. And I just think that if we're going to have productivity, it's important to say this is where we're at. And it's a very complicated thing to reconcile.
Indeed, so that we're coming around to saying, is there any part of this that works? But the cynical answer to that, of course, is the ones who get paid think it works. So there's lots and lots of highly critical social work to be done. We have time for 2 more comments.
I think I had a conference call. My name is Ruth Hart. I'm an emergency medicine physician for 20 years, and I was a lucky recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities years ago, and got to work with Ann Hutchins Jones and Rita and so forth. But on Monday, I had a conference call with 11 of my partners, and they don't know that narrative medicine exists. They've never heard of Rita Charon. They wouldn't be caught dead here. And I had the plenary in the United States of STFM 2 years ago, and a guy that wouldn't go across the street to see me went to Denver to see me, and met me out there and gave me a fellowship. But what I want to say is that my department instituted an anti-narrative. Dr. Dursey knows about this in emergency medicine. It's called, McKesson puts it out. And it takes away narrative. You walk in with a computer and you have a point and click. It's
Right.
Rita, have you worked with this yet? My department paid $1.25 million, and I started last July saying that this wouldn't work. And the 11 guys got on the phone and they pleaded with administration for this system. And on Monday, the chair went back and said, we don't want the system. We're not hearing the patient's story. Can you imagine? In fact, they said, Ruth, you get to say I told you so. So I had the delight of instituting the first literature and medicine module at Oxford in medical school. And I just got back from there. So in the month where I was frantic that I would have to learn to point and click. So for those of you who don't know, it's 70 clicks. The computer assembles, you point. So for the demented, the handicapped, the illiterate, English as a second language, you have to pick something. If they can't say it, you have to pick it. And you assemble this. In fact, you can't even say where the patient hurts. You have a body and you click on where the pain is.
Oh, dear.
Now, the demographics are such that if you're a
Oh, dear.
This is unbelievable. This is anti-narrative. Now, the medical students I took in February to the theater to see Copenhagen to talk about where knowledge can be good or evil. I now show them, I would be showing them on Tuesday when I get back, how to point and click this. It assembles it. You know what was very interesting? You know what they didn't like? It ruined the patient interaction. You don't get the same story when you have the computer between you and the patient. So I think it's very, very interesting that for the people who they'll never hear about this, they do not know, and the whole thing on the telephone was, we can't hear the patient's story. So I think there's a point for narrative, whether you're at this conference or out there. And I just want to say how important it is to me. Thanks.
I see a hand way at the back. Stand up.
Thanks. I'm going to pass out from Thomas Jefferson Medical School.
Louder.
I'm Emily Pass out from Thomas Jefferson Medical School, and I teach medical humanities. I just wanted to respond to some very provocative comments which have provoked the following observations in me that I'd like to throw out. Number one, the very appellation, narrative medicine, I think itself shifts our focus from something which has the connotation of technological, procedural, and coldly investigative, i.e. medicine, to the individual, which is narrative. So as far as that really very interesting question about the whole power question, it seems to me that by virtue of the fact that narrative medicine invites us to take the patient's story into consideration, it really reshifts the power dynamic, true in a conceptual way, but reshifts the power dynamic conceptually from the patient as the object of all these procedures, et cetera, and the totalitarian or authoritarian environment of most medical centers to the individual consciousness. So I think that it really restores it, even if there is a mediating person, because as was mentioned earlier, how else would the voice of these various people be heard? The second point I wanted to say, and then I'll finish, is speculating about why photographies are so popular. I've been struck by that also. Maybe it's a refuge in our very cynical society. It is still a refuge of heroism. And I'm trying to use that word neutrally if possible. In the sense that the tragic heroic, in the sense that it focuses our attention on the individual's struggle, and it doesn't resolve ambiguities, but it illuminates ambiguities. Because illness itself plays a very peculiar part in pathologies, to the degree that it provides a person a certain amount of insight. It becomes a beneficial element, even if physically it can be very, very disruptive. So I think it seems to be the sole remnant, as far as I can tell, in our society, of the heroic struggle, even if the person succumbs to physically cognitive illness. So that's my statement.
Thank you for your comments. We're going to have to close the discussion. This afternoon, we will talk in much greater detail about the literary theoretical aspects of this work with James Olney and Abraham Verghese. Those of you who have signed up for the lunches, you will find the groups assembling around the round tables, and we will do our best to start up at 1:15.